As soon as we start living to other people's expectations, I feel like that's really when we lose our own willpower. We lose our own idea and our own perception of things just because we're relying so much on other people's, value of us. How people perceive us now becomes something that we kind of use to contradict everything we do. And I feel like a lot of times in my own experience and in my own life, this is something that I've done a lot. I feel like when people are actively looking at, how people are perceiving them, we lose sight of our actual goals. The actual people that are for us now, we kind of render, they're hidden to us now because we're just using other things, because we're using other people or other ideas, we're incapable of kind of creating things ourselves, now because we're absorbing so many other different perceptions and so many other different ideas, we can't be authentic in that sense. And that authenticity is definitely something we're lacking nowadays. I feel like that's definitely the most important part of kind of growing in that sense, when a lot of people are like that, it's just damaging, and without that authenticity, we have to realize that we're not ourselves. We're not able to grow. We're not able to experience the things that are actually for us because we're trying so hard to fit this certain mold that a lot of people have put us in. I feel like a lot of times when people are giving us their perception of us and kind of showing how they feel, they can kind of box us in a cage. They can kind of limit us to certain things or say that we can't do these things. When we have to realize that we set our own ideas, we set our own parameters in this very sense. When we're allowing people to control how we feel about things or how we want to go about things or even how we want to have our relationships, we have to realize that we're now damaging ourselves. We're not able to experience these things in our most complete, perfect way because we're letting other people determine it for us. Other people have different definitions, and now you're using these definitions to define your own life. In that sense, it's not something you can do. You're walking into someone else's home and using it like you use your home. It's definitely something that we're lacking when we're talking about our own dependence. When we're trying to find these better relationships and form these better connections, I feel like a lot of times that's what people are doing. They're not realizing that it could be very harming in that sense. We have to be more independent in finding ourselves. You know, Finding yourself, I feel like a lot of times is something that's so conflicting for other people, but they don't realize that finding yourself is something that happens naturally. There is no secret code or zen to it. I feel like when you're experiencing life, when you're able to kind of grow, kind of with this idea that there's open experiences, when you have the no rigid plan or no strict idea conforming you to do certain things, to say certain things, to act a certain way, we're able to experience life. I feel like in that sense, it's good to be prepared, but when we don't have a specific plan, or a specific expectation for even other people in our life, we're able to let things kind of flow naturally. There is no disappointment, there is no hardship, there is anything that we're missing out on. It's just naturally. When we just let it kind of flow like that, it's a lot better. I feel like as soon as you start giving people expectations in your life and kind of set this rigid plan on this is what I want from this person or this is what I want from this, we're losing that authenticity. We're losing the real opportunities to happen just because we're so set on it being this specific thing or this specific goal. I feel like a lot of times we're kind of romanticizing potential in things rather than things themselves. And if we want to have these things naturally come about, if you want to have these things kind of be this good experience, we have to realize that we can't invest too much into it. When we're investing so much love and so much effort, immediately off the rip, we have to realize that we're now so much more easier to disappoint. Now because it's not reciprocated, because it's not valued, we feel like it has no value, and then we kind of talk down on ourselves and say, now we're not lovable because of this experience. We have to realize it's all just hardship, it's all just growth. We have to realize that the love we give isn't something that can be taken away because it's just omnipresent. It's something that we can always give. It's something that we always have for anyone that comes into our life. If we want to experience things better, we have to realize this. We have to have our own expectation of ourselves and kind of let things flow naturally in this sense. When we're letting things kind of just do what they want and kind of just let life naturally happen, I feel like that's the best time. That's the best time to really do anything. These expectations can be so limiting and conforming that I feel like it's very hard to naturally kind of just break out of it. It's not something where people are understanding it. It's not something where people are kind of trying harder, and I feel like it definitely sucks. It sucks to know that people are letting anything they hear on the internet or anything they hear in person from other people determine their life. Someone that doesn't care nearly as much as you care about yourself now has this saying factor, this controlling factor in your life. And I feel like that's what's so hard about it. That's why it's so hard to change. That's why it's so hard to do a lot of these things. When we're letting these kind of expectations kind of just cloud our judgment, what are we actually doing? What type of life do we want to live in this sense? And it's hard, and I feel like honestly, it'd be better if we kind of just set our own experience and our own goals, in front of us. We definitely have to stop listening to what other people say. Just because you're doing these things, we have to definitely ask ourselves if we're doing it because we want it, or if we're doing it because we want people to see it. And I feel like a lot of times this is what people are doing. It's very superficial or maybe materialistic, or maybe you're saying, oh, I want to give this revenge, or I want to have revenge on this person, or show this person what they missed out on. And we have to realize that that is now owning us. That is now something that's going to damage us because we're letting it, control us so much. Because we're letting it kind of be this thing in our life, it will now control everything. And that's what it exactly means to kind of hold a grudge or to hold resentment from other people. Now you're incapable of doing it yourself, like when you hold resentment and you hold grudges for other people and kind of have this need to get revenge, we have to realize that we're not able to experience our own life because of this. Now this person that has hurt us, now this person that we want to prove wrong has so much power over us. A lot of times we're not doing things because we want it, but we're doing things because we want these people to see it. We're doing it because we want these people to say, damn, I missed out on this person, or I should have done this, or I should have done that. And making that person feel regret brings you nothing. That doesn't bring you any sort of happiness. That won't bring you any sort of peace. You have to realize that what happened already happened. And if we're only living and only doing these things to make people kind of envy us or kind of feel a certain way about us, we're not living for ourselves. And when we live for ourselves and we're actually happy and we're doing our own goals, that's when we're experiencing life. That's when people will realize these things that are going on around you and realizing that they missed out. That's not something we have to prove to anyone. We've already proved it to ourselves. When we're able to leave that situation and to feel good about things again, we are now taking that step and saying, I'm living my life better than I was before. And people always do that. And I feel like I've definitely struggled with that even in my history, just wanting people to see me, just wanting people to kind of have this second guess motion about me that maybe this person was worth this and I missed out, and it brought me nothing. It only made things harder once I realized that now because I didn't achieve this goal, now because I didn't get this thing, maybe this person was right about me. Maybe they were right to do me this way. Maybe they were right to hurt me in this way. And that is when it becomes so self-destructive. We definitely have to stop letting people just affect us as a whole. And I feel like that's something that not a lot of people are realizing. Not a lot of people want to understand or really value or even try to appreciate, because it's just something that's happening so often. It's something that's just always there that will bring us these problems, that will bring us these hardships. And we have to be better about it. We have to be more positive for ourselves because people aren't positive for us.